Welcome to the All of Life podcast from Redemption Church Tempe, where we have conversations on faith, culture, theology, and beyond to help us live all of life, all for Jesus. Let's jump into today's episode.
Welcome to the All of Life podcast, where we believe all of life is all for Jesus. My name is John Crawford, and I'm one of the pastors here, and I'm joined today by one of our co-lead pastors, Josh Butler.
Yep.
And I am excited for this podcast because I have never had a conversation with someone before who has thought more deeply, biblically, and theologically around what we're going to be talking about today. And we're going to be continuing a conversation from First Wednesday, couple weeks back, where we were talking about sex and dating. So we're going to have a conversation to look at a lot of the questions that were texted in. We did text in questions.
Yes. First, though, we got to share a little funny story about what happened with these texts. I think you guys sent in like 30 to 50 texts, and what happened, John?
We got all of these texts around questions around what's the purpose of sex, is looking at sexual immorality and sex outside of marriage, is masturbation a sin, all of these texts.
But we made one big mistake, man, We put the big phone number on the screen to text these questions into, and we were one digit off.
One digit off.
And that one digit makes all the difference. Like horseshoes and hand grenades, man. Close is not good enough.
Yeah, that one digit meant that some random dude who does not go to Redemption Tempe received a barrage of texts around biblical sexuality, and I can just imagine him sitting watching Netflix, and all of a sudden
is masturbation okay? Like, how close can I get with my girlfriend or boyfriend? What does God think of this dating relationship I'm in? This guy's just gotta be like, or girl, whoever. He's just got to be like, where is this going? I'm sure the first one was. Like, what? Like somebody got the wrong number. And then the second and the third, and by the end, maybe it's like, dude, God, are you trying to tell me something?
Or this is the worst prank that somebody has done to me. Oh, man.
And they would have been all different phone numbers. Anyways.
So that's what happened, and we did text him to apologize, but it's one digit makes all the difference. And so we are, what we're going to be doing on this podcast is addressing all those questions that were not only texted to him, but were meant to be texted to us. And so I'm excited. Josh, you have written on this topic. You've got a new book that's going to be coming out around these topics around sexuality and sex. And so one of the questions that came in from the night is just starting big picture. When we talk about sex, especially as we try to think Christianly through a Christian worldview, like, what is the purpose of sex?
Yes, I would say sex is iconic. Like, its purpose is to be a window into the relationship we were made for with God, the union and life together that we were made for with God. So in Ephesians 5:32, Paul says, he quotes kind of this classic wedding formula from Genesis 2. He says, "For this reason, man will be leave his father and mother, be united to his wife, the two will become one flesh." He's quoting kind of Genesis 2's foundational wedding formula verse. And then he goes on to say, this is a great mystery, but I'm talking about Christ and the church. And at that point, that's kind of Paul's mic drop moment. Like, boom, he's saying, this is about that. Sex is about salvation. Not sex is designed to be your salvation, but it's designed to point you to the one who is. That sex is designed to be like an iconic window that you look through. And you think about an icon, the idea is like, historically, you weren't supposed so much to look at them and stop there, but to look through them as a window into these greater realities. And Paul's going, man, sex is a window into the nature of salvation, the union of Christ and his church, the life together, the security, the faithfulness, the covenant. And when he says this, he's not making this up out of left field. He's riffing off of a theme that you see throughout the biblical story, that God's relationship with his people in the Old Testament is described and defined as like, God's saying, I am your husband, you are my bride, and we are united in life together forever. So God's covenant with Israel at Sinai, for example, is depicted as a marriage covenant. It's depicted as Jewish weddings were actually modeled off of the covenant ceremony, kind of Moses, Mount Sinai, 10 Commandments, that whole scene, and like takes up a big chunk of the Old Testament. That scene at Mount Sinai is actually depicted as the bride being united with Yahweh as her husband. And then you see throughout the biblical story, like when when the people are unfaithful, it's described as adultery.
Yeah.
It's actually like cheating on Yahweh with these other gods, these other lovers and all. And so throughout the biblical story, we see sex and sexual imagery and marriage and marital imagery used to depict the kind of relationship that we were made for with God. And I think this is important because it helps explain why some of the prohibitions are such a problem, right?
Yeah.
Some of the things that the Bible says you're not supposed to do, some of the things that God says, don't do this with sex, right? There's a reason. It's not just because God's an uptight, rule giver going, hey, I want to make your life miserable. You got to jump through all these hoops. It's not that. It's going, I think God's putting safeguards or boundaries around going, here's what it looks like to do the icon well, like to actually represent this thing well. And here's things that are going to corrupt the icon or are going to distort the image that sex is designed to display. So for example, divorce, I would say one of the reasons that the Bible speaks so strongly about divorce is that it violates the union that we were made for with Christ, right? Like it preaches a false gospel. Like divorce implicitly speaks to this reality. It speaks to the sense that like Christ's union with his church is not secure. It's unstable. Like stuff could come along that could ultimately rip it apart, That's not to say there are not circumstances where someone might be justified in separating from their spouse, and we've talked about that in the past, but it's saying even when that happens, it's tragic because it is tearing apart the iconic vision of the gospel that this was meant to display. Or you think of adultery, like why it's so horrible when someone cheats on their spouse or is unfaithful. Yes, because it hurts their spouse, but also in this bigger picture, it preaches a false gospel. It speaks to a God who would be unfaithful to his bride or a church who would be unfaithful to Christ, And so all that to say, like the purpose of sex is that it's designed, sex and marriage and all these things are designed to be this window into the union and life together that we were made for with God.
Man, that's beautiful. I love even just how you hit on the difference between image bearing versus rule keeping, because I think a lot of times when people think about the biblical sexual ethic, they think that God is this uptight, this rule keeping. Here's all these things to kind of strip you of your joy. When really you're saying, hey, this is actually how we bear image. This is an icon into salvation, which is beautiful.
Yes.
And at the same time, what you just described seems like the moment that we're living in for this biblical sexual ethic, Christ's design for it, it is not viewed as beautiful in our society, but is actually viewed as offensive. It's viewed as harmful. And so for us as the people of God, how can we publicly embody like Christ's purpose, his design for this sexual ethic in our cultural moment?
Yeah, great. Well, yeah, I think that you use some words that I love that I love to use too, which is I think we need to move from rule keeping to image bearing, right? And what I mean by that is kind of two different mindsets. With rule keeping, it's not saying that the rules don't matter. God gives us boundaries and things for our well-being and our good.
Yeah.
But there can be a rule keeping mindset that kind of goes like, man, I just need to jump through the hoops to keep God happy, to not mess up, to not step out of bounds, and yet. I don't really trust these rules are for my good. They're just kind of things that God set up to, I don't know, he doesn't, maybe I feel miserable and he doesn't care. And, and when that's your mindset, it's like, dude, it can really lead to legalism and moralism and performance. And so I think you see some folks who are like trying to keep all the rules, but they're like, I just don't know that I buy it. And then over time, I think you've got a lot of kind of Christian subculture or deconstruction, things that are happening where people are going, like, I tried it. I tried purity culture. I tried standing by. I tried whatever. And it didn't work. I still had a bad experience in marriage. I still had whatever. And it's like, it didn't work. So I'm done and I'm out. And so you've got like, on the one hand, it can fuel the rule keeping mindset. It can fuel either legalism on the one side, like I'm trying to perform to keep God happy, or it can fuel disillusionment on the other side of going like, dude, I tried the rules and they didn't work. And the problem underlying, I think, is that we're looking at it as rule keeping and rules that we don't necessarily feel bought into, And if we shift it to image bearing, I think it includes the rules. It goes, yeah, God's given us rules to help us know how to bear his image well, but the end game is not so that I have this success or prosperity in my sex and marriage life, in my sex life or my marriage life, whatever. The end game is how do I image God well into the world,
Wow.
And so that's going to mean things like I'm going to commit to my spouse before I unite with them, because that reflects an image of a God who commits to us before he unites with us. I am not going to walk away and leave my spouse or cheat on my spouse, because that reflects a God and a Christ who would walk away from or cheat on their spouse. I am going to sacrificially lay down my life and love and serve my spouse because that's what Christ has done for me, and I want to reflect the image that he has laid down for me. And the end game becomes, and then that means even when maybe if I'm single and I don't want to be and I want to get married but I can't, like I am actually though going, how do I reflect the image of Jesus, who is single, who never got married and yet experienced the fullness of human life? How do I experience greater intimacy with him in my singleness? And if I'm in marriage, my marriage gets hard, it's going, dude, rather than like, dude, this doesn't feel fulfilling anymore, it changes it to, how do I reflect the image of Christ even in this situation that feels really difficult and hard? And I believe singleness and marriage become spiritual formation, right?
Yeah.
Like marriage is spiritual formation. They become a context in which God is shaping and forming our character. I think of the phrase, one person, like the primary purpose of marriage is not so much your holiness, your happiness is your holiness,
Oh, yeah.
And going, I think it's both end. Like I do think there's in the big picture that statistically, at least just generally, it's for wisdom piece, like marriage does tend to make you happier, healthier, wealthier, live longer. There's those kind of things, especially if you push through the hard seasons. There tends to be benefit on the other side. That's general. That's not universally true. So I know loads of people close in my life who've had some really brutal, hard marriages, right? So that's not like a promise. But there is this piece of going, for good or for bad, I believe God can use your marriage and God can use your singleness as a place for like a workshop for spiritual formation where you're being formed and chiseled in the image of Christ. And so the goal becomes not, how do I keep the rules to get the goodies in the end? The goal becomes, how do I reflect the image of Jesus as he's shaping and forming my character to be more like him?
Wow, that's so good, man. And even just with the conversation around spiritual formation, man, that is so good. I feel like there's that's almost like those are buzzwords now in kind of our Christian evangelical world around spiritual formation, but a lot of times we kind of narrowly define that to these practices that we do, right? Which those are, but you're actually broadening it to saying, hey, the way that we embody this faithfully, following this sexual ethic as image bearing, is a way that we are actually spiritually formed. And I love that because that broadens it, but also it gives a beauty to God's design for us to embody as his people, rather than just a moralistic keep the rules, but yet as a formational method in our lives and by his design. So, man, that is so good. I love the way that you unpack the purpose of sex. And so now what I would love, we had a lot of questions that came in around, okay, well, hey, that's the purpose of sex, but how do we now address maybe things around premarital sex, right? And specifically, one of the questions that came in was, what are the passages in the Bible that speak about premarital sex? Specifically, are there passages that forbid it? Are there, as you just talked about, hey, God has some rules for our own good that we can embody this icon. What does Jesus have to say about premarital sex?
Great question. So first thing I'd say, a couple of things. One is, if we start on kind of that iconic big picture level again, I'd say that God commits to us before he unites with us. Right? We see this throughout Scripture. God is a God of covenant who commits to his people before he unites with his people. And so one of the reasons I believe that you should, sex should consummate marriage rather than come before it, is because that accurately reflects the God who is committed, who is all in on just that iconic level, right?
Wow.
But now digging into some of the details, right? Jesus and the New Testament talk regularly about sexual immorality. You'll see that phrase come up a lot in your Bible, sexual immorality. And the word there in Greek, it's porneia.
Yeah.
And if you want to go, okay, well, what is porneia? Well, in Jewish culture, in Hebrew culture, if you want to get like a definition of porneia, I love a lot of scholars talk about this. You think of porneia as like a hyperlink word, right? You think you click on the hyperlink and it takes you back to the backdrop or other articles, things about the word. If you were to click on porneia, the hyperlink in the Bible, it takes you back to Old Testament law, particularly in like Leviticus 18, Leviticus 20, in that area where there's a bunch of kind of the purity code and laws and things like that, purity related to sexual ethics and things, right?
Yeah.
And there's a variety of different forms of things that fall under porneia, but what they all have in common is that they are sex outside of marriage. like sex outside of legitimate marriage, right?
Yeah.
As God's designed and created it. And so if you were to ask I think maybe an interesting thought experiment to do would be to place yourself into first century Israel with Jesus as you're hearing him talk about sexual immorality and just go, what's he mean by that term? Everybody who's listening to him knows. Like one of the first things we have to do with scripture is understand its context. Everyone who's listening to him knows, dude, that's like Leviticus 18. That's like, dude, sex outside of legitimate marriage is sexual immorality, is porneia. And so I think scripture is very clear, both in the Old Testament, it's explicitly clear, and in the New Testament, Jesus and Paul, and it shows up throughout the New Testament, reaffirms this is outside the bounds of God's way for his people. It is dangerous. You're literally playing with fire, so that's big. Another thing I'd point to is if you go to Genesis 2 and the end of Genesis 2, verse 24, this is like the classic wedding formula. It's like the foundation for understanding what marriage is in the Old Testament. And it's where God makes Adam, pulls Eve from Adam, and then from the one he makes two, and then the two are able to come back together and become one. And it says, Genesis 24, for this reason, because what's the story that's come before with Adam and Eve, for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother, be united to his wife, cleave to his wife, leave his father and mother, cleave to his wife, and the two will become one flesh.
Yeah.
Now, that's one tight sentence, and you don't see, one of these decisions in there is you don't see a wedding, right? Like it's a wedding formula, but where's the wedding?
Yeah,
there's no catering, there's no violin playing, there's no drunk uncle making the awkward toast at the wedding speech, there's no rings. So for a wedding formula, it's kind of awkward. It doesn't have a wedding. Where is it? Well, it's actually in that leave and cleave phrase, right? Like the leave and cleave is covenant language, and we see that it shows up throughout, especially the first few books of the Bible, like in Deuteronomy, for God's relationship with his people, that we would leave, we would abandon or forsake. It's strong language. We would leave all of their idols, all of their allegiances, and we would cleave and cling to God alone. And God promises, that we are to cling to God. Israel is to cling to God as a wife clings to her husband, to cleave to him in the covenant. And God will cling to us. He said, I will never leave you or forsake you. God said, I will never leave you. And it's the same word, I will never leave, but I will cling to you and cleave to you in this covenant, there's security. And so for ancient Jewish audiences, when they heard that and read that passage, what they were seeing was the first thing that comes first in the wedding formula is you leave and you cleave, right? Like you exit your family unit you came from, and you're now forming like a new family unit that's going to form out of this. And it says, and then the two will become one flesh, and the two will become flesh. And that one flesh is speaking to just what it sounds like, dude. Like it's physical union, it's sexual union, where the it's right, I think we have a lot of euphemisms for sex in our culture. You got like swiping right, or you got between the sheets, or
Netflix and chill.
Netflix and chill, exactly. And what's interesting to me is like all those talk about kind of around sex, like between the sheets, where it takes place, or swiping right, like how you're going to meet the person, or Netflix and chill, kind of setting the context or the mood, where it's going to have whatever, right?
Yeah.
And you can kind of go, oh, those are explicit, but the Bible's more discreet. And it's like, no, it's not, dude. One flesh. It's talking about the metaphor is the reality. Like sexual union itself, it's putting the metaphor front and center to go, this is about two bodies becoming one, becoming integrally united, conjugal union. And the order, the flow that we see in this wedding formula is first you leave and you cleave, and then one flesh. That covenant comes before consummation. There's an all of life commitment. Creates the security and the foundation and the context in which sexual union is designed to reflect this relationship between God and his people.
Dude, the covenant before consummation is so good. The seeing how this images the gospel of God always commits to us before he unites. And really, the question here of, does the Bible have anything to say about premarital sex? Yeah, a ton, right?
Totally, dude.
Sex outside of that is not God's design. It's sinful.
Yeah. Like you said, dude, I mean, just there, man, even that, the gospel, dude, like Jesus says, I will never leave you or forsake you. I am all in. I'm not going anywhere. You can count on me. You can rely on me. There's nothing that can pull me away from you, neither height nor depth, nor principalities, nor powers, nor anything in all creation will be able to separate us from what? From the love that is in Christ Jesus our Lord. Jesus is committed through thick and thin to us as his bride. He is not going anywhere. And that means that there's no fear in his love. We don't have to worry that he's going to take off. We don't have to worry that we don't please him anymore. Our wrinkles start showing up, or he's not going to be around. Like he is all in. And the question that I would have, for us is going like, dude, are you reflecting that image of Jesus in how you're approaching dating relationship? Are you Are you going, hey, before we actually unite our bodies, I'm going to commit to uniting my life, you know?
Man, that is so good and so beautiful, and gives us a different vantage point to look at even just how that question is framed. And so, one of the other things that comes out, kind of that flows out of this question around premarital sex, oftentimes we get in the church because of the moment that we're living in culturally, where, you test drive the car before you buy it, right? Like, well, I don't know if I want to marry this person. I need to live with them to see, hey, is this the one, right? And so, my question is, well, what about living together? What about cohabitation? Is it sinful to live together? And I know a lot of times people say, oh, we're living together, but we're not sleeping together. We're not having sex. We sleep in different bedrooms, that whole deal. But what is the biblical sexual ethic and even just this sex as icon? How does that speak to just the question around people living together before they're married?
Yeah. Well, a few thoughts on that, man. First off, so we already talked about kind of theologically, and I think it falls in the same category of no, don't do it.
Yeah.
But I don't think it reflects the image well in that sense. But even just practically, I think a few things are worth looking at. One, I mean, you just look at statistically, if you kind of go wisdom category, hey, what's wisdom, what's wise discerning? Cohabitation does not work nearly as well. Like I don't have the stats on me, but they're significantly lower, like for breakup, for all that. And often the sense is, well, maybe we'll get married down the road. Like you said, we're going to test drive it first. And often marriage either doesn't happen. Marriages that do happen are less successful. And why is that? Well, folks who study it and just kind of the mainstream, saying why doesn't cohabitation work as well? One of the things they talk about is like the sliding versus deciding factor, right? That with covenant, what you're doing is you're like committing, you're going, hey, I'm evaluating this person. I'm really checking, is this who I want to unite my life with forever? And I'm making a solid commitment. And through that process of going, dude, we're doing this. Like I'm committing to you in public, before friends, before family, for everyone. I'm going to be with you through thick and thin and vice versa, right? So that's deciding. You compare that to sliding, where it's kind of like, this is sort of the next stage in our relationship. We kind of been dating for 6 months or a year, or maybe this is easy. We can kind of save on some rent. We kind of be around and let's see how it works, that kind of thing. But you kind of slide into it. And one of the things that the folks who say this have found is like that people tend to slide into it and they'll enter into living together with someone that they actually wouldn't be as stoked necessarily on to marry.
Totally.
And then they get kind of stuck in this back and forth where, and honestly, dude, this is gender dynamic that we talked about at First Wednesday. So if you want to go back and listen to my opening talk there, because a lot of people today get ticked off if you talk about gender dynamic. And it's like, dude, it's just statistical reality, right?
Yeah.
Is that more often than not, it's on the women's side of the equation where the studies show like women will tend to more often see cohabitation as a step towards marriage, and guys will see it more often as a step towards postponing marriage. Right?
Totally.
And so you get often a dynamic that's going on where the girl's trying to tug him along into greater commitment, but he's feeling more like, dude, well, this is working well. Why not? And that can lead to frustration, pent-up resentment, bitterness in the relationship. Why is she always so upset? Why is he, and just those dynamics can be really unhealthy, just on a very pragmatic level. But then you zoom back out to the big picture and I go, dude, you're not, it's not the icon, dude. It's not the image-bearing reality. You're not bearing witness to a God who covenants because he goes, dude, I've seen the good and the bad and the ugly in you. I've seen the whole deal, and I'm in. Like, I'm committed to you.
Totally.
Like, it's not presenting that picture that the level of intentionality and commitment and the reality of going, dude, before sexual union takes place, the ideal is going, dude, we're going to commit not just to one another, but before our friends, before our family. Our relationship doesn't exist in isolation. Sex is public. Dude. It has public ramifications. This is possibly how you may have kids come into the world. You have all these different things that are our emotional health, our physical health, all these different things that are wrapped up in how well this marriage or healthy thing goes. It's a social institution, and it's worth declaring your commitment before God, before family, before friends, before others. And so I think cohabitation just, one words for sin is missing the mark. It totally misses the mark on God's iconic vision for it.
Man, yeah. One of the things that I'm reminded of when you were just saying that is even just 1 Corinthians 6, where Paul writes to flee sexual immorality. Going back to that word porneia, right? And with cohabitation, you're not fleeing. You're actually flirting with it. And like the difference of, man, Paul's saying run in the opposite direction from this, but yet moving in is actually saying, no, we want to flirt with it. We want to dance on that line of, hey, there's a temptation here for sexual immorality. And Paul's like, dude, run the opposite way because of everything you just said, which is really helpful, I think, and a good word for even people in our church, in our congregation who are maybe even asking that question right now. They're in a relationship and maybe it's, hey, we should move in together, of saying, man, this is not an accurate reflection of the icon.
Yeah, totally. And I think the danger is not just that, oh, we might have sex together, which is like going to happen, right? You know, I'd be shocked if it doesn't, right?
Yeah.
But it's also that we're going to enter into this emotional intimacy, this union of lives. Like we're going to unite our lives together at this level, yet we haven't yet committed to each other at that level.
Yeah.
And so I think it's it is the sexual portion of that, but I think it's more than just that. You know, it's like, this is more than just a roommate. If it's like a romantic relationship, you're like moving in that way. There's not just the danger of sexual union before covenant, right? There's also the reality of an emotional union and a uniting of your lives. One of the other reasons they say that cohabiting couples that it's not working, they have a hard time breaking up too, is because now your finances are intertwined, your rent is intertwined, your pets are intertwined, you're all, you know, like you've united your lives together. And so they said a lot of people will just kind of settle. So, you know, like, dude, well, hey, it's easier to just stay in something that is not a healthy thing, even though we haven't committed yet, and you get stuck in limbo land, you know? And so I for a lot of reasons, I think both the sexual union and just the emotional uniting of lives and the practical uniting of lives.
Financial, all that.
Totally, where you haven't covenanted yet to justify that level of commitment and intertwining your lives together.
But you want the benefits of the covenant, right? It's like, hey, we haven't committed, but we want the benefits of that.
Yes.
Man, that's great. You know, one of the things that has been pretty predominant in the church over the last number of decades is going back to what you were talking about with rule keeping. There's something called purity culture that has been pretty big in a lot of churches, a lot of evangelical churches. And purity culture has actually really wounded a lot of people. And I know you hit on it at the beginning of the podcast, but man, I would just love to hear you speak into that. How can the church help with healing the wounds of purity culture? And then forward trajectory, how can we do better as the church?
Yes, totally. So problem with purity culture as a movement, I'd say a big picture, you know, was false promises, right? Like it held out often an if-then formula. I love author Caitlin Beatty. I love a phrase she puts to it. She says it was really a sexual prosperity gospel, right?
Wow.
Which, if you're familiar with prosperity gospels, false teaching that tends to use like these if-then formulas. Like if you do this, then God will do this. If you say this or pray this way or whatever, if you do this, then God's going to bless you. He's going to bring this thing. And the if-then formula, the prosperity gospel of purity culture, not universal, but often went something like this. Like, if I save sex for marriage, if I play my cards right, if I wear the purity ring and do the different things, then God's going to give me this like supermodel husband or wife with the off-the-wall sex life. And, back when we were kids, it'll be Pamela Anderson or it'll be like whoever, like George Clooney or whatever, like
the Baywatch girls, man.
Totally. That's going to be like, God's going to bring that person as a reward for my faithfulness. So if I do this, then I'm going to have this awesome marriage. And so I can empathize, dude. If you're like youth pastor or whatever back in the day and you see kind of sexual culture is just kind of going crazy and you're going, how do I motivate these kids? How do I put a carrot on the stick to keep them, keep their pants on? Like you're kind of like, dude. But I think it led them to make false promises that conflict with the gospel, that was going like the reason to pursue purity is to get the goodies at the end that God's promised. And God didn't promise that. And you get yourself in big trouble when you start promising things that God hasn't promised. And so I think some of the aftermath of purity culture is a lot of that generation grew up and then got in marriages and sex was hard. Marriage was hard.
Yeah.
Life didn't work out. People had been faithful and experienced sexual abuse, experienced outside marriage, experienced trauma, experienced these things and just going like, dude, I held up my end of the bargain and God dropped his.
Yeah.
And the problem was that people have been preaching God's end of the bargain that he never made. And so that's one of the challenges. So I would say this, though. I think you have a reaction against that in many that is saying, well, that didn't work. So I feel disillusioned of whether I can actually trust the biblical sexual ethic. And this is where I'd go back to our image bearing thing, right? The goal in rule keeping is image bearing, is going, the goal of purity is not to impress God so that he'll give us the good stuff. The goal is to reflect the purity of Christ's love for us. Right?
Yeah.
Like the goal of being sexually faithful to Jesus as Christians and how we approach sex and sexuality and all, the goal is not to impress God and get him to give us the rewards. The goal is to reflect the purity of his love for us.
Yeah.
Now, that said, I do think there are benefits that come from that, right? Like, purity culture was wrong to promise it, like universally, like if you do these things then. But the reality is, like sociologically, statistically, historically, and still today, marriage has been shown again and again, on average, in general, to lead to being happier, healthier, wealthier, living a longer life. You know, there's a whole bunch of reasons for that, stuff we can get into if we wanted. But the idea of going, I would say it is wisdom to say, I am going to seek to build a mature foundation of sexual faithfulness for the potential of marriage down the road, right? Like, it is wisdom how I treat in singleness, in dating, and in marriage, how I treat my sexuality actually has a lot of general, practical, pragmatic impact and implications, probably long term. So I'd put it more in the category there of like wisdom, of going like, dude, wearing my seatbelt doesn't ensure that I'll never get in a car accident. But it's still a wise thing to do. But like driving the speed limit. That would be a better one. Driving the speed limit, it's not a guarantee that you're never going to get a car accident, but it is going to increase the likelihood, and you're going to be in a better spot than if you're speeding 50 miles over the speed limit everywhere. So I think similarly, reflecting the purity of Christ's love for us is our primary goal. But in all likelihood, there's a lot of wisdom in it of going, dude, this is creating a better foundation for a greater chance at a healthier long-term life.
Absolutely. Man, continuing on that theme of wisdom, right? You said multiple times that it is wisdom, and looking at wisdom, man, when we're talking about just sex, premarital sex, sexual immorality, I think a lot of people as they're dating, they're like, okay, where's the line, right? Like using wisdom, how close is too close when we're talking about sexual intimacy, when we're talking about, man, should there be a hard line? Is there flexibility on that? But what would you say around that question? Like, how close is too close, Josh?
Yeah. Well, I'd say this, a few thoughts. One is your level of commitment should match your level of intimacy, right? And here's a little bit of a litmus test that I like to use for this is going, assume, maybe you guys, maybe the couple, maybe you're not in the same church together, but assume you are. Like, could you break up with them? If you guys broke up a week from now, 6 months from now, whatever, could you still be good friends at church and have it not be awkward? Because one of the challenges, I think, when you over-enter, like a high level of intimacy, physically, emotionally, like all those different things, yet you don't yet have the level of commitment as kind of a foundation to support and safeguard that, then if you don't end up getting married, like it's dude, Holly, my wife, she always says, dude, her advice, especially, her advice to couples who are like, yeah, we broke up, but we're trying to stay friends. She's like, no, don't, because she knows how far people tend to have gone physically and emotionally and all that. And then you try and stay friends, and you're just like in this emotional tug of war drama. Like one person inevitably maybe is still hanging on to something, but the other person isn't, or maybe vice versa, not, And it's just like, dude, it's essentially like if you're going to the more you intertwine your lives, the more trying to pull them back apart is difficult without just a hard, fast cut break. And so I think on the wisdom front there is going like, dude, safeguard with the level of commitment for your relationship before you go deep intimately, right? And obviously we were saying, dude, sex is designed for covenant, sexual union of bodies. I'd say, too, like, dude, my 2 cents, I think it's wiser to be on the safe side than to go too far, right?
Yeah.
Like if the question is how far can I go before I've kind of broken the boundary, I think you're asking the wrong question. The question is, how do I reflect Jesus to the person I'm dating? Then I think you're going to walk a lot more Yeah, it's a different mindset.
It is. It's a different question. How can I reflect Jesus to the person I'm dating? That's a completely different framework and mindset.
Yeah, and a word to the guys as well, man, because I'd say, again, guys and girls, everyone's unique, right? But generally, there are some general themes between how men tend to approach sex and dating and everything, and women. And I talk to a lot of women in our church and just in my life, historically and all, who feel used by guys, right? Like when it relates to physical intimacy in a dating relationship, for a common theme I've heard is like, dude, I feel like he just was using me for my body,
Yeah.
And for the guy at the time, it was kind of like, oh, I want, like, for them, it communicated, hey, I want to be intimate with you because it makes me feel closer to you, those kind of things, right?
Yeah.
But when there wasn't that level of commitment and security, like of covenant, especially, like, I think there's a dynamic there that ends up wounding a lot of our Christian sisters, guys,
Absolutely.
when you press too far, too quick. And I'd say, honestly, dude, we're seeing it in the Me Too movement. Like, whatever you think of the movement as a whole, some of the intricacies of the movement, like, the reality is it exposes and it displays that there's a power dynamic in how these relationships go down. And ask yourself, guys, how many of those accusations are men against women? Zero, zilch, right? Like,
totally.
The common theme is, dude, how men have pressured or exploited or manipulated or abused, like, in the pursuit of sex. And I think to the guys in the room, you got to go over and above and beyond to go, dude, if I'm going to reflect Jesus, I need to be really proactive in this right now because I don't have some of the historic safeguards of a community and culture and people that were helping to reinforce this. A lot of it's landed on you, on your shoulders, going like, dude, you need to re-up your commitment to going, my highest priority in this is to reflect Jesus to the person I'm dating.
Yeah.
And that means I need to be aware of an implicit power dynamic that's probably in the relationship and how I approach sexual intimacy, emotional intimacy in relation to that.
Man, I love that too, because just tying back into what you said that I love is that we've hit on almost every question is this rule keeping versus image bearing. And even the question to reframe it of how can I reflect Jesus, the person I'm dating, frames it not in rule keeping, but frames it in image bearing versus how close is too close is kind of like, well, there's a rule, there's a hard line. If you cross this, then you're breaking the rule versus, man, you're saying like, dude, let's reframe the entire question that is really beautiful. And I think for the guys who are listening, like that should be, especially if you have marriage in the future trajectory of what does it look like to reflect Jesus to a female that you're dating, when also that's what Jesus calls us to, is to reflect Christ to our wives, right? To lay our lives down for the sake of our wife. So how close is too close gets at sexual intimacy with someone else. But one of the questions that oftentimes Christians ask is, what about masturbation? So I'm not doing it with someone else, but I'm actually pleasuring myself. And Josh, what would you say about masturbation? Is it a sin? Speak to that.
Great, man. Well, first off, so if we're going to talk about masturbation, I think we need to talk about pornography, right? Which is an epidemic, I would say, right now in our culture. Like, dude, it's just the accessibility that it's now on your phone, the high resolution, like simulated reality, like heading towards virtual reality, all that stuff, and the addictive nature of it and all. And I would say, dude, when you're, so most folks are talking about masturbating, you're talking about masturbating pornography, right? Like when you're doing that, you are rewiring your brain.
Yes.
You are releasing dopamine to images on a screen. Like you are rewiring how your brain and your body physiologically approaches sexual intimacy.
Yes.
And this has massive ramifications, both for it's the addictive nature, the fetishization of certain things that it tends to lead you down certain rabbit holes because of the increased novelty. Like there's always something more, something new, something fresh, And I would say it is making you sexually dysfunctional, or at least more sexually dysfunctional potentially for marriage down the road. I know you had done some research on some of this as well, John. You were saying
In my undergrad for my capstone, I did my undergrad in counseling and behavioral studies, and I did my capstone research on the negative effects of pornography on men, and even just on the dysfunction of it. I think you get into the biological dysfunction where those who become addicted frequently use pornography, end up actually in young guys, they're seeing in teenagers, actually are getting erectile dysfunction. And you're no longer able to even become aroused to a physical, embodied human because of the high speed, this kind of fantasy land that pornography paints that is not real. It's not realistic. And I think the other thing that leads you down the road of dysfunction is so often when the conversation around pornography is had, it's, well, you shouldn't do it because it's harmful. But I have found that there's usually not a conversation around the future effects, the long-term effects. Even if you stop viewing pornography, you can never get those images out of your mind. They're seared into your mind. Every single person I've ever talked to, they remember the images very vividly the first time they viewed pornography.
Probably because of the chemical stuff going on, seared through your brain as you're,
Yeah, I think it's norepinephrine that sears it in your brain. But then what that does is it creates this fantasy, this false narrative of how most pornography is shot. It's like the woman's begging for it, and all of a sudden it's like ripping off your clothes, having sex in these crazy places, positions, all this stuff of like, but what oftentimes isn't talked about is these pornography.
That is not how it works.
That's not how it works.
Yeah.
And these pornography companies that are filming it, they have the best video editors around. I mean, they're making billions and billions of dollars. And so they edit out all of these things that make it seem like, oh, this is how it's going to be. And if that is the narrative that you're told as a young man or young woman,
it's a lie.
And then you get married or you're in a relationship and it's not playing out that way, all of a sudden you see there's sexual dysfunction.
Yes.
It inhibits the intimacy. It creates sexual frustration, even aggression. And it is very, very dangerous.
Yes, totally. And so, okay, from that point, then you could say, well, hey, but I'm not using pornography. I'm just masturbation. And I say, well, dude, you can be your own pornography factory in your mind. You know, like you can be creating with images of people or people you've seen, all that. And dude, that's dangerous territory for some of the same reasons. And one of the thoughts, my mind goes to Matthew 5, where Jesus talks about lust. He's talking about adultery, and he says, essentially, he goes, hey, you think just because you didn't have sex with another man's wife, whatever, like you think just because you didn't commit adultery, you're okay. But I tell you, if you even lusted after her in your heart, that's where the root of the problem is. And Jesus is constantly doing this. He's constantly pushing deeper than the behaviors to the affections and the desires underneath the behaviors. And so I think one of the dangers is going like, dude, if you are in your heart, in your mind, in your imagination, in your desires, you're objectifying people and there again, spiritual formation. You are forming yourself as a person biologically, spiritually, physically, like in all these different ways, emotionally, in all these different ways that are not setting you up for success, reality. And the danger is, dude, spiritual warfare and reality, dude, we're in a culture right now that is, the temptation for that is ever present everywhere and is kind of affirmed by and large, and this is a great thing. Now, I think you zoom out in the bigger picture, what's one of the dangers there? Well, with God's design for sex, I'd say two major purposes historically have been seen as the unitive and the procreative, right? Like have been the uniting of bodies and the generation of children. This is how life gets generated into the world, new life. This is how you and I got here. This is how we're all here, And we kind of talked about this a bit at the first Wednesday night, but how some of the challenges like with contraception, we can talk about that. Like, there's pros and cons with contraception, just more like how you approach it. But we have a society that's become used to severing sex from the procreative dimension. Just going like, oh, that's the organic union possibly leading to the bringing of children into the world. That's been kind of lost, where it's seen as more like a secondary choice. Now, do I want kids? How many? We could talk more about that sometime, but that's just like the organic connection to that has been lost in our mindset, the way that we approach sex in our culture. But I'd say with masturbation, it disconnects sex from the unitive. Organically, sexual union was designed for the union between two people. Like their bodies, their soul, their life, all that. And so one of the challenges with pornography, with masturbation, with all this is that it severs the unitive dimension. And as you're saying, like long term, it can lead to this difficulty of actually experiencing sexual satisfaction in life together with another person, because you've trained yourself to get all that, like by turning inward rather than, it's just the heart of it, like the united and the procreative means it turns you as a person outward towards your spouse, and then outward as a couple towards your children, and so rather than this kind of turning you outward in sacrificial love that God's designed it to do, it turns you inward on yourself as just kind of a self-satisfaction, towards the ultimate pursuit is self-satisfaction rather than sacrificial love.
Man, that is rich and that is good. So, one of the questions that came in is just around dating and marriage. So I'm dating someone, and how do I know if they are the one? Oftentimes we hear like, oh, there's the one out there, and I'm looking for the one that's going to complete me. And how do I know if they're the one, if I'm dating?
Great. Okay, so I would say this. I do believe in the one, but not the way it's usually meant or stated, right? I would say like, you don't marry them because they're the one. Mm-hmm. They're the one because you married them.
Yes,
right?
yes.
Right? Like you don't marry them because they're the one. They're the one because you married them. Like what makes them the one is they're the one that you have covenantally committed to. Going, I'm going to be with you through thick and thin, through hell or high water, like through it all. Like we're going to be in together. And so, and I think one of the things that's been interesting for me, if this has been. Working cross-culturally, living in some places with like arranged marriage, right?
Yeah.
Now, I am not saying that we should go back to arranged marriage or, that's still big in parts of the world. It's been big historically. I'm not saying that, but here was the observation. Some of the happiest couples I've ever encountered, and they're like in their 80s now, are like arranged marriages. And they're head over heels in love. I remember one couple, I lived on the Navajo reservation with a family there for about 6 months. And the husband and wife, John and Rena, they had never met until the week of their wedding, like the week going into their wedding, right?
Wow.
And even then, it was the family talking, and I'm not saying that that's the way. I'm not doing that for my daughter. That's not what I'm saying. Like that's the ideal. But what I am saying, what struck me was they were one of the most head over heels in love couples that I've ever met in my life, and the way, dude, you could see Rena sticking. Smiles and glances at John as he was walking away. Like you see John like making the special effort to like, man, bring something home for Rena. And what struck me was, I think part of the logic is going like, dude, it is part of the growth of intimacy and all these things is through the building of a life together.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think we've often got it backwards there. There's kind of the Hollywood conception that you get married, it starts hot and heavy, and there's all the intimacy and all the fun, and then there's sort of the long downward decline, right?
The honeymoon stage that leads to the decline, right?
Totally, dude.
Yeah.
And I think like done right, it actually is kind of the opposite, dude. I think often you get married at first, it's a little awkward, you're clumsy, you're fumbling around, you're figuring things out, like, well, sexually and in life together and all that, And then as time goes on, though, and you build a life together in the context of covenant, security, and commitment, you go through some of those hard seasons, you go through some of that tough stuff, like, they become the one,
Yeah.
And I love, there's a quote, I think it was Stanley Hauerwas, theologian, he said to the effect of like, you always marry the wrong person, right? And what he meant was, you become like 7 different people through the course of your life. You're going to have different seasons, different phases. If you have kids, that changes you. If you change careers, that changes you. You get older. 10 years later, I'm way different today than I was 10 years ago. And so is Holly,
Totally.
And part of the power of covenant is that you're united to this person through all those shifting seasons and changes. And so they become the one because they're the one that your life has been yoked to as you go through all these shifts and seasons and formation all together. And you hit 80 and you're on the front porch in the rocking chair looking out at the sun going down, whatever, and it's like, dude, there is an intimacy that comes from a life built together. And so I would just encourage you to go, rather than I got to go out and find the one, I think it's going, dude, the one is the one you marry.
Yes.
And so then it's just more, how do I show wisdom and discernment and going who I'm going to commit my life to?
Yeah. Yeah, that's great, man. That raises the question even on attraction. I think so many people are looking for the attractive person, and that is like their sole criteria in dating right now as far as who am I interested in dating? Who do I want to marry? I want to marry the hottest, the most attractive, the most handsome. And so, just for the folks listening that are dating, like what's good criteria or what's bad criteria for even finding a spouse?
Yeah, great. Now, a few thoughts. One, I like you put it at First Wednesday. What you had 3 things. I think first was Jesus, like faithfulness to Jesus.
Yeah.
What were your 3?
Yeah. So someone had asked me as they were dating and saying, "Hey, what is helpful criteria?" Because my answer was in response to attraction, where she was saying, "Hey, it seems like all these guys only care about attraction, and for me as a female, what role should attraction even play?" And I said, "Hey, if I'm to give you 3 ingredients, these are the order. I would say find someone who has an unwavering commitment to Jesus. Not just like, oh, I'm a Christian and I show up at church every once in a while, but like somebody who is deeply committed to following Jesus, pursuing Jesus in rich community, tethered to a local church. But after that, I would say friendship, like a deep relational friendship with the person. And then the third, I would say attraction. So if you're wondering where attraction falls in, I would say put attraction. And not that it doesn't matter, but man, the unwavering commitment to Jesus, the deep relational friendship, and then attraction. And mainly because oftentimes physical attraction is the external.
Yeah.
And here's the thing. We're all getting old. We're all getting ugly. Like that's just the
wrinkles
nature of
are
like,
coming. And
dudes are going bald, gray hair, wrinkles are coming. We're getting, all of that stuff. And so if you are basing your relationship and your commitment on solely external appearance and whether you're attracted to them, that's going to wane. That's going to fade. But the thing that biblically even that we see of like, man, the Lord looks at the heart. And if we are concerned with the pursuit of godliness and character and how someone loves Jesus, that actually doesn't become old and phase out. That's actually the thing that increases in beauty. The longer you walk with Jesus, the more you become like him. And that becomes even more beautiful. So when you're 80 years old and you've been married for 45, 50 years, if that is what you are most attracted to, you're going to be head over heels for your spouse because they're going to continue to grow in godliness.
Totally, man. And that's great, man. Because I do think, like you said, Jesus, friendship, then attraction. Because I do think attraction, I don't want to discount it or shove it to the side completely. Because it's a longer conversation, but I think there's reasons why psychologically, historically, men are drawn, have certain ways of being attracted to women. Women have certain ways of being attracted to men. But I would say, like, if you're letting that drive, and it's kind of a unique thing today that, like, we've really, as a culture, put that front and center and gone, this is the primary thing that's driving it. No, and here's what I would say, like, I think your question, the healthy question to be asking is not, who do I want to have sex with, right? Like that tends to be the main question. Be like, who do I want to have sex with for the rest of my life, whatever. Yeah. I don't think that's the wrong question to be asking. I think a better question to be asking is, who do I want to build a family with and a life with? Looking for things like, dude, do I see this person as being a good husband to my kids or a good wife to my children? Do I see this person as being someone like 20 years from now when we're getting older or whatever, like is this someone I want to hang out with and just be with? Because often, like, here's 2 observations I made. One is often, I find a lot of folks that you might be first attracted to, and then you get to know them and you're like, nah, And yet on the other hand, there might be some people I found that, like, dude, before I got married, back when I was dating, I remember there, even one scenario in particular where I was going to be with this small crew of people for a whole summer. We're doing a bunch of stuff together, and I remember thinking, oh gosh, I don't want any relationship drama, whatever. So I hope there's no one there, And I remember at the beginning of the summer, like, not at all, But then there was someone whose character started shining through. Their joy in the Lord, their love of Jesus, their sacrificial heart for others. And by the end of the summer, I was like, oh my gosh, dude, I don't know if I've ever been, as attracted to someone at the time back in that season of life. But it was just like, there is an attraction that godliness and good character and joy in the Lord, those kind of, that happens over time. It's usually not the kind of thing that you see on a magazine cover, but it's the kind of thing that, like, in the context of relationship and friendship, and if you're looking for that, that's the kind of thing that doesn't fade. That's the kind of person you want to build a life with. That's the kind, so I just say, what are you looking for? Don't go into it going, who do I want to have sex with for the next rest of my life? Look into it going, who do I want to build a family with together before Jesus or God?
Yeah, that's so good, man. And on dating, we talked about the purpose of sex, but what would you say the purpose of dating is? Oftentimes there's, in our current moment, there's just kind of this casual dating, there's all these apps and really no view of commitment in mind. Like, what's the purpose of dating? And is casual dating biblical, would you say?
Yeah, the purpose of dating, I'd say, is finding someone to marry. Right?
Yeah.
So on the one, I think that, the purpose of dating is not like, hey, I just want to go have some fun. And, like, I think if you're talking about like romantic relationships with another, with a man or with a woman, and you're stepping into that, I think the goal should be going, dude, I'm ready to be exploring marriage. That doesn't mean you got to propose on the first date or anything like that,
Yeah.
But it's a mindset that you're going in very differently. I think if you're going to like, I'll kind of hang out with some people and see how it works out, whatever, I'd say then get some friends, and yeah, you can be friends, friend groups, friends of the opposite sex, in just kind of a general way. But dude, if you're pursuing kind of a one-on-one romantic relationship with someone, I think the goal should be discerning, is this someone I want to commit to in covenant? Is this someone I want to build a life with, a family with? Is this someone I want to be pursuing Jesus together with, and are, looking for those kind of things. I think it's just wisdom to go, to know when you're going in, here's kind of why I'm in this. And I remember when Holly and I first started dating, and I think it was, on our second date, it was like a week later, it was maybe like a week after our first date. And I think I said something to the effect of like, hey, just so you know, like, I'm not messing around. I'm not like asking you to marry me right now. I'm just saying, like, the reason that I'm dating you is just, dude, seeing, if we're compatible, for marriage, that kind of thing. And she talked about just being shocked in a good way, just going like, dude, I've never had a dating relationship like that, where that was just upfront conversation on the table at the beginning of like, here's why we're in this, exploring that. And if it doesn't work out, that's fine, but but as long as there's honesty and transparency on the front end of why we're in it. And I think that's a radically different mindset. Again, I'd say a lot of the cultural mindset right now around dating is much more ultimately about self-satisfaction and gratification.
Yes.
Like, does this person, do they help me have a good time? Do they meet my emotional needs, my physical, like, do they help me have fun, basically, and it's not that fun, those different things are bad. It's just, it's not iconic, it's not, again, that bigger picture of what God's designed this thing to be about and reflect.
Yeah, I'm reminded of Jim Mullins has his whole contrarian's guide to dating. And one of the things that he and his wife, Jenny, will say is, don't just, when you're dating someone, don't just date to be entertained, which means like, all you ever do are the fun things, it's like you're always going out, you're trying to entertain each other, but that's not actually real life. And he says, like, go serve somewhere, go babysit someone's kids, go actually do things that you're going to do once you get married, because the entertainment of this kind of casual dating of it's all for me, self-satisfaction, that's not reality. And I think that's helpful. Just to think through of, even if you are dating someone, like, what are the activities that you're doing, and are these things that you're going to continue to do for the rest of your life if you marry this person? Yeah, there's fun, there's entertainment, but that's not all you're going to do, Man, so one of the other things that came in the text question is just around this term equally yoked. And man, what does it mean to be equally yoked? And then what does that look like? Specifically in the context of maybe somebody's listening, maybe the person that texts us in is, maybe they're in a relationship with someone who's not a Christian. And what would you say to that, Josh? Great.
So the image of being equally yoked, so a yoke, back in the day you had oxen, let's say, right? And you had this yoke was like kind of a wooden thing you put over the neck of each oxen and kind of yoked them together. So basically, like, all the work they were doing, they were kind of joined at the hip, so to speak, or joined at the neck, right? So they're doing their work and they're laboring, they're in it together. And now the idea of being unequally yoked is if, like, dude, you got one strong oxen, that kind of thing, and you've got one with a broken leg that can't walk. It's like you're going to be you're gonna be struggling trying to pull them along. And so the context here now it's not that's a bad analogy in one way because the context of being unequally yoked. It's not saying like you're a go-getter and you're doing all this great stuff. And let's say I think a lot of marriages where friends right now where one is now dealing with mental health issues or another's dealing with a severe illness, and dude, marriage in that means like, dude, I'm caring for my other oxen here, that we're yoked together and they're hurting and I'm serving and loving them and caring for them through that. So it's not so much about the physical thing. The way it's used in scripture though is about a Christian being yoked together with someone who's not a Christian, right? Yeah. And so the idea is going like, dude, if I'm going to explore entering marriage with someone, we want to be equally yoked means we want to be all about Jesus, right?
Yeah.
Like we want Jesus to be front. So we want our mission statement for our marriage is all of life is all for Jesus, right? Like all of our marriage is all for Jesus. And here's what I think that does mean and doesn't mean. I like to put it this way. I think it's less about looking at their history, where they've been, and more about looking at their trajectory. Where are they going? Right?
Yeah.
That because the gospel is gospel of grace. So it's not going, I'm looking for the perfect person who's got all their ducks in a row and has this great past and whatever else. It's more going, dude, I'm looking for someone who's sold out for Jesus, who has signs and evidence and display of maturity and commitment and growth in their life, and that we're heading towards the same destination.
Yes.
So I've seen in the past folks who it's like, dude, there's the, I don't know, quote unquote, like the Christian girl, quote unquote, or a Christian guy who's got all the signs of like, dude, they grew up in the church, grew up in youth group, they got all the different things, and you kind of look back, they haven't slept around, they haven't done whatever, and you kind of look at them and go, oh man, they're kind of glowing, like they got
check the box,
they got
right?
the aura, they check the box,
yeah.
But you get to know them, and that's just countless times, dude, where they've kind of grown up from that past, but they're heading on a trajectory. They're deconstructing their faith. They're kind of disillusioned with whatever. They're kind of on the other road. And it's like, dude, I would way rather take over that. If you're looking at marrying someone, rather than that, where they're on a trajectory that doesn't look as healthy. Someone who's got a gnarly, rough background. They've done the sex, drugs, and rock and roll thing. They've been whatever, and yet they've encountered Jesus and they're on fire in love with him. And they're going, he's my all. He's where I'm going. He's where I'm heading. And now, even if there may be some, there could be some rough things that come out of all of our histories, depending on where we're coming from, but going like, dude, I want to be with someone that's heading towards Jesus. So like, you think about the oxen, if you're going to yoke up, I don't care so much where you've been in the last half of the field. I care where you're going to the next half of the field. I want us to be going in the same direction, same momentum, same thing. And so, you look in the gospel and constantly, like God chooses a bride, God chooses a spouse who has a checkered history, checkered past. And so I don't think we need to be looking for perfection in a spouse. A lot of folks are, whether cultural standards of perfection or quote unquote sub-Christian, kind of Christian versions of like perfection or whatever. Like that's not what we're looking for. Like when you're looking for a spouse, I think you're looking more for trajectory. Like where are they going? Are they sold out for Jesus in the kingdom? Is this someone I want to build my life together in the future in sort of this quote unquote field that we're working of life in God's world and his kingdom? Are we on the same road together?
That I love the way that you said it's not so much history but trajectory, and like, man, we believe in a gospel of grace and the trajectory of what does this look like to pursue Jesus it's just beautiful. Man, I've got one more question that just for you that came in just around resources. Obviously, there's a lot in all these topics and conversation that we're having. And what would you recommend, Josh, on books, resources, anything for people that want to dive deeper into this?
Yeah, man, that is a great question. So, honestly, I should have thought about this beforehand because I've been immersed in the in the forest for so long, or in the trees. It's hard to kind of zoom out and get to the forest. So, man, honestly, I think I may have to think through it and put it up in the show notes because, here's a few thoughts. Dude, on the cultural dynamics of sex today, one that I've really appreciated, there's a book called Cheap Sex, The Transformation of Men, Marriage, and Monogamy by a guy named Mark Regeneris. And some of the talk that I gave at First Wednesday, that was inspired a lot by that, heavily inspired, influenced by that. So if you're interested in kind of diving deeper into, he's a sociologist. He's a Christian. It's not a Christian book. But it's like an Oxford Press. So it's academic, but it's easy to read still. It's well-researched, well-written. It contains data from the most extensive, I think it was the 2017 Relationships in America study, which is the most comprehensive, in-depth analysis and study of romantic relationships in America. So if you're looking for kind of cultural analysis, like where are we right now and what's going on, like I'd say that's a really great one. When it comes to kind of a Christian positive vision for sex, you should check out my book when it comes out. I'm joking.
No, hey, that was going to be what I said, man. My book would be when your book comes out. That will be my new favorite book. I know that for sure.
But one I've been inspired by, I just kind of throw out there. So, so Pope John Paul II, he wrote this classic kind of theology of the body. So he's Catholic. I'm not Catholic. I'm not saying we're Catholic or anything like that, right? So don't read into what I'm saying too much here, folks listening. But it was fascinating for being, I think when I read that, just going, man, he is thinking through sex not just moralistically, but theologically. Like, how is this thing designed to actually display and represent something of who God is to our world? Now, that thing is like super heavy, thick, academic, long text, but there's a guy named Christopher West who's done some work trying to popularize it, and he's got some stuff that I don't land with him everywhere he lands, so don't say, hey, you're going to read it, and that's totally what Josh thinks. But he's got one called Introduction to Theology of the Body that I think could just be interesting or inspiring for kind of going, dude, here's some helpful ways of seeing how this is actually really beautiful, and it's designed, like God's designed this to point to something that's just glorious and beautiful. So I thought that might be a helpful one for kind of like the beauty of the Christian sexual ethic. And or there's another one that's called Not Just Good But Beautiful. That it was hosted by the Catholic Church, but it had Protestant speakers, people from all over the world kind of submit, like N.T. Wright is in there, Rick Warren from Saddleback, like things like have articles, papers, things in there. And so you get from a variety of different vantage points just saying, hey, this isn't just something good, it's actually beautiful. God's actually designed Christian sexuality to be something glorious and beautiful.
Yeah. Man, that's so good, so helpful. Josh, dude, thank you for the work you've put in this. This is edifying and a blessing to not just our church, but we know that your book coming out is going to be a blessing to the church. And just such a pressing cultural moment for us. And yeah, thanks for your time, man. Thanks for giving us windows, or what we can say icons, to view this conversation, and really appreciate you, man.
Thanks, you too.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the All of Life podcast. To get more information on Redemption Church Tempe, you can download the Redemption Tempe app, or you can send an email to tempe@redemptionaz.com.